When I was growing up, I lived in a small town with a population of only a little over 2,000. Everyone knew everyone, and the whole town felt like a family. I spent wonderful summer days exploring the outdoors with neighborhood children. Our neighborhood bordered an expansive, thick forest. Because we could easily get lost, we weren't allowed to go inside the forest, but could play around the outside of it. We would climb the trees around the edge of the forest and try to catch a glance of a deer or a squirrel. One day, our group of friends decided to play hide and seek. It was the same rules as always. We could hide anywhere in the neighborhood as long as we didn't cheat and hide inside one of our houses. The neighborhood was small with only about 10 houses, so it wasn't as challenging of a game as you would think. The seeker had 1 hour to find everyone hiding, and if they didn't, they lost the game. We kept track of how many games each person won, and at the end of the summer, whoever had the most wins was declared the champion. On one particular day, my friend Robbie was the designated seeker. He was a very good player, and at the time, he had the most wins in the group, so we knew we had to pick a really good hiding spot. Normally, I would go off on my own, but this time, I was completely out of ideas to hide, so I decided to go with my friend Fiona. Fiona could always think up the most creative hiding spots and was rarely found before the hour was up. Fiona and I took off running towards the border of our neighborhood. The seeker only counted to 30 before he began searching, so we had to find a place to hide quickly. We reached the woods, and I was surprised when Fiona gestured for me to follow her. I stopped running. "We're not supposed to go in the woods," I reminded her. "Don't worry, we won't go far. We'll just go far enough that we're covered by the trees. There's no way he'll find us," she told me. Reluctantly, I followed after her. We continued running for several minutes. "We're getting too far away from home," I shouted eventually. "Just a bit further, trust me," Fiona told me. We ran for a couple more minutes before finally coming to a stop. I looked around and I didn't recognize anything. The woods were thick and we hadn't used any sort of path. "Fiona, I think we've gone too far," I told her. She looked around, her eyes wide. For the first time, there was some fear evident on her face. "It'll be okay. I know the way out," she assured me. We hung out at our hiding spot for a while, chatting and talking in the beautiful scenery. The forest was definitely intimidating, but it was also beautiful in a way that I had never noticed before. There were so many butterflies and other stunning forms of wildlife. Eventually, Fiona glanced at her watch and said that the hour was nearly up. We needed to start heading back. We turned and began walking in the direction we came. It felt as if we had been walking longer than we should have. "Are we lost, Fiona?" "No," she said, but her voice wavered a little. "Yes, we are!" I exclaimed suddenly. "Look at that! We passed that tree ages ago. Remember you pointed out the bird's nest in the limb right there?" I told her, pointing to a bird's nest, and I knew we had passed more than 15 minutes ago. Fiona was silent. She knew I was right. We were going in circles. We decided to go in the opposite direction. Clearly, the way we had been going wasn't right. It was getting dark and I was getting worried. Neither of us had phones or any way of calling for help. "What's that?" Fiona asked, pointing out in the distance. I could see a fire burning. "Thank God. It's probably someone camping. We can ask them to borrow their phone or get directions at least," I said. Normally, I would be hesitant to approach a stranger I stumbled upon in the woods, but at this point, we were getting desperate. We walked towards the fire and came to a clearing. Sure enough, a large, heavy-duty tent had been pitched next to the fire. The fire was still lit, but I didn't see anyone around. Excuse me?" I called out, thinking that the person was in the tent. The seconds ticked by and no one answered. I was beginning to think that maybe they had left to go collect firewood or something. "I guess we'll just wait here until they come back?" Fiona said. She had no sooner gotten her words out when there was an enormous crunch behind us. When Fiona and I spun around, we came face to face with the most terrifying creature I have ever seen in my life, and probably will ever see. It was at least 7 foot tall and wore a long black cloak that covered its face. Its legs were impossibly long and it had pointy yellow nails. In one hand, it was grasping a dead deer. The animal's throat had been slit and it was dripping blood onto the ground. Even though I couldn't see the creature's face, I knew it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I think Fiona and I stood there for at least a couple seconds, frozen in fright, until we finally began running. I ran like I had never ran in my life. We weren't going in any particular direction, just sprinting and screaming as we did. I couldn't get the image of the creature out of my head. I was too afraid to look behind me to see if it was chasing us. And we ran and ran until finally I could run no more and dropped to the ground. "What was that?" Fiona asked me in between gasps. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here right now," I said. I was looking around in desperation, searching for any possible way to get out of this situation. I was staring at a tall oak tree when suddenly it came to me. "I'm gonna climb the tree," I told Fiona. She looked at me as if I had gone crazy. "It'll give me a better vantage point, and I can find out where we are." I climbed the tree very quickly and soon was high up in the air. I looked out, and much to my relief, I saw the familiar sight of my neighborhood. It wasn't far. We were surely less than a mile away. We had probably been close the whole time and just didn't realize it. I climbed down the tree, a triumphant smile upon my face. "We're close. We'll be there in no time. It's just about a mile to the north," I told her. We knew we had to go quickly. It was getting darker and darker, and it would be much harder to know where we were going in the dark. We also had no flashlights or anything that we could use to light the way. Being stranded in the woods at nighttime when that creature was still out there was not something that I could handle or even consider. I was running and Fiona was following me. I was confident I knew the way. I never felt more relieved when I saw a light ahead and I knew we were coming to the clearing. We were nearly out of the woods. The light made me run even faster. I would never go into the woods again. My parents would never have to remind me. Finally, we stumbled out of the woods and we were back at our neighborhood. The first thing I noticed was the red and blue lights. There were police everywhere and news crews. I realized we had been gone for hours and everyone had probably thought we had been abducted. I heard a voice yelling, "There they are, there they are!" And suddenly my mother was hugging me, tears running down her face. After reuniting with our parents, we told them and the police about the creature that we saw in the woods. My parents shared a knowing glance and the police officer cleared his throat awkwardly. I looked at Fiona in confusion. Why weren't they acting surprised by this? Did they not believe us? In a calm voice, my mother explained the adults in town knew all about the creature in the woods. It was a legend that had been around for a long time. The creature had lived in the woods for years. It lived off of meat it killed itself. But once, years ago, a little girl wandered into the woods by herself, and the creature attacked her, but she got away. She told everyone what she had seen and gave the same description of the creature that we had just given. When this first happened, law enforcement warned everybody to stay away from the woods while they searched for the creature. Everyone listened except for one man. He didn't believe that the creature really existed and wasn't scared. He went into the woods, but never came back. Police found his body, but he had been dismembered and put back together. The only thing that was missing was his head. Ever since then, the adults warned their children to never go in the woods. When their children grew older, they would tell them the truth about what really existed out in the woods. I was chilled to the bone. I couldn't believe my parents had kept something like this from me for so long. They asked me not to tell any of the other kids about what we had seen in the woods, and I agreed. It took me months before I would even play outside again, and I never went anywhere near the woods. At my high school, there is a tradition that seniors take part in right a couple of weeks before graduation every year. It's called Senior Assassins. Each person playing has a target that they have to take out using a water gun before a certain deadline. Meanwhile, no one knows who their target is. Could be anyone in the grade, even one of their closest friends, which leads to a lot of paranoia. The game continues until there is only one person left and they are declared the winner. It had always sounded like so much fun to me, and I looked forward to my chance to play for years. There's a few people that moderate the game. They determine who each person's target is. They also run a Twitter account that is dedicated to the game. The week before the game begins, each person gets a direct message from the account on Twitter that'll tell them who their target is. Then, as the game goes on, the account will share daily updates of who got eliminated. There were a few rules to the game, such as not telling anyone who your target is and not spraying in the face. Pretty much everything else was fair game. I received a message telling me who my target was the weekend before the game began. His name was Billy Prescott. Billy was basically on every sports team and incredibly muscular and fit. He could easily outrun me, so a sneak attack would be the best way to go. I could probably get him after his lacrosse practice at the end of the day. The game began that next Monday, and people took it really seriously. Some kids went out and bought giant super soaker water guns just to make it all the more entertaining. Much to the teachers' annoyance, there were water battles going on seemingly in every direction that day. Kids were getting knocked out of the game everywhere you could think of, from gym to the cafeteria. By the end of the day, a decent amount of people had already been eliminated. I was still standing by the end of the day, but I also hadn't managed to get my target. My mom had texted me to pick up some items from the store that she needed for dinner, so I didn't have time to stick around after school for Billy's lacrosse practice. I planned to do it that week. As time went on and there were fewer and fewer people left still standing, the game began to get super intense. It was common to see kids walking through the grocery store or down the sidewalk with a water gun in hand. Everyone was watching their backs, never knowing who to trust. Friendships were even being put to the test. I still hadn't managed to take out my target because he had been out sick for a few days. The second he got back to school, I planned to be prepared to shoot him so I could finally get it over with. That Friday, I had an important history test. It was going to be a big portion of my final grade in the class. I had been up late studying and was super nervous when I took my seat and looked over my notes one last time. I heard the bell ring and I knew I was about out of time. A few kids were still spilling into the classroom as our teacher, Mr. Gallagher, prepared to begin handing out the tests. I saw Billy take a seat in the back of the room. Maybe I would get my shot to take him out today after all. One last kid came into the room and took the open desk next to me. His name was Martin. He was thin with shaggy hair that partially covered his eyes. He didn't talk much and always sat alone at lunch. Martin set his silver water gun down on the desk. I was surprised he had decided to take part in Senior Assassins. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would enjoy group activities like that, but I had never really spoken to him before aside from offering him a pencil when he forgot one once right before a quiz. He had acted particularly grateful for the simple act. I cleared off my desk, and Mr. Gallagher began walking around the classroom handing out tests. When he got to me, I started straight away. We only had an hour, and I wanted to make sure I finished on time. "You know the rules, Martin. No water guns out in class. Please put it away," I heard Mr. Gallagher say in a tired voice. He had been repeating this rule all week. A few moments passed, and Mr. Gallagher said, "Now, Martin, I'm waiting." At this point, I glanced up in curiosity. Martin was the last person in class to cause a scene. I watched as Martin picked up his water gun and pointed it at Mr. Gallagher. There was a sudden, incredible, loud bang, and with shock and horror, I watched as Mr. Gallagher collapsed on the ground, clutching his chest. I wiped my face, and when I looked at my hands, I saw that there was blood on them. My brain struggled to work through the shock that Martin had brought a real gun to school. Martin stood up and was pointing the gun around the class at different people. Everyone was screaming and trying to get cover. I was too shocked to even move. Suddenly, Martin was looking at me very directly. His eyes bore into mine, but his gun was pointed away from me. "Get out of here," he said to me. I stared at him in terror and confusion. "Go! Get out now!" he yelled in a loud enough voice that I scrambled to my feet and sprinted out the door. I was in the hallway by the time I heard shots ring out. The second I reached the front office, I began screaming that there was a shooter and to call 911. The office staff rushed into action. The receptionist called law enforcement while the principal placed the school on lockdown. I just sat in the waiting area sobbing uncontrollably and wondering which of my classmates were injured or dead, and why Martin had decided to spare me. What was special about me? A SWAT team arrived and we were eventually escorted out of the school one by one. We went to the middle school across the street where our parents had been instructed to pick us up. That evening, my parents and I sat down on the couch together to watch the local news. We learned that 3 students from my class had been shot and were in the hospital, but were expected to survive. Mr. Gallagher sadly did not. But the most shocking aspect of Martin's attack was who was able to take him out. Billy had grabbed a globe off Mr. Gallagher's desk and hurled it right at Martin. He dropped the gun and several students tackled him to the ground and held him there until SWAT arrived. After that incident, our school banned Senior Assassin. What had begun as what was supposed to be a lighthearted game to celebrate the end of high school turned into a bloody tragedy that will haunt me the rest of my life. When I was in college, my little sister Caroline was only 4. Despite our huge age difference, we were like best friends. I had wanted a little sister terribly all my life and was overjoyed when my mom informed me that she was pregnant with Caroline when I was in high school. By that point, I had assumed my parents were done having kids, so the surprise was wonderful. It had been hard to go off to college and leave Caroline when she was so little. I didn't want to miss any of her milestones. Luckily, my college was only about an hour away from home, which allowed me to come home and visit frequently. One day, I was driving back to my parents' house for fall break. I was about halfway home when I noticed that there was a decent-sized garage sale going on out front of an old house. I loved thrifting, so I decided to stop for a little bit and have a look around. One of the people at the garage sale told me that the items had belonged to the owner of the house, an elderly lady who had recently passed away. Her family was trying to get rid of all of the stuff so that they could sell the house. There were some really beautiful items, including some gorgeous clothing and jewelry, but there was one item in particular that really caught my eye. It was a very large Victorian-style dollhouse. It was absolutely stunning, and I knew I had to get it for Caroline. It cost a decent amount, but seeing the smile on Caroline's face was going to make it all worth it. I paid for the item and loaded it up into my car before finishing the rest of my journey home. Caroline ran to hug me the second I swung open the door to my house. I picked her up and swung her in the air in excitement. I told her that I had a surprise for her, and she immediately began dancing around the room in excitement. I told her to close her eyes and then presented her with the dollhouse. She screamed in delight and began playing with it right away. She absolutely loved it and spent the rest of the day playing with it up in her room. That night, I was awoken out of a dead sleep by Caroline pulling on my blanket and whispering my name. I rolled over and looked at my alarm, and it was 3 a.m. "What do you want? It's the middle of the night," I mumbled, my brain still half asleep. "Can you please tell the little girl to get out of my room?" "What little girl?" "There's a girl jumping on my bed and pulling my hair," she told me. "You're just dreaming. Come on, you can sleep with me," I told her. Caroline snuggled up next to me, and I instantly fell back asleep. The next day, I spent some time with my friends and family and didn't think about Caroline coming into my room the night before. That night, after everyone in my family had gone to sleep, I had a craving for some brownies, so I decided to quickly throw a batch together. I was just taking them out of the oven when I saw Caroline crossing the living room. I figured she was probably having some sort of nightmare again. "Hey Caroline, do you want a brownie?" I called out in a hushed voice so I wouldn't wake my family. Strangely, Caroline did not respond or even turn to look at me. "Caroline?" I called out again. I walked into the living room but didn't see any sign of her. I walked upstairs and opened Caroline's bedroom door and saw that she was in bed, completely asleep. I could hear her softly snoring. I was confused. I was so sure I had just seen her downstairs. I shook my head to clear my mind. It's late. I'm just tired, I thought to myself. I cleaned up my mess in the kitchen and then promptly went to bed. The next morning at breakfast, I decided to ask Caroline about the little girl she claimed had been jumping on her bed the other night. She gave me a scared look before responding. "She looked just like me, with curly brown hair and green eyes," she said. My blood ran cold. Was it a ghost I had seen the night before? Caroline went on to say that the girl rearranges things inside of her dollhouse and does other things to annoy her. By this point, my parents were listening and getting concerned. It wasn't like Caroline to lie. After Caroline had left the room, my mom asked me what I knew about that old dollhouse that I had brought into the house. I told her nothing besides the fact that it had belonged to an old woman who had passed away recently. My mom was worried that some sort of bad spirit was attached to the dollhouse. maybe something tragic had happened to one of its previous owners. I was skeptical, but was all uncomfortable with the thought of sleeping another night with the dollhouse still in Caroline's room. We decided we needed to dispose of it properly. We told Caroline that although we were taking the dollhouse away, we would get her a brand new one that would be even better. She didn't object. That night after Caroline had gone to bed, we burned the dollhouse in a bonfire in our backyard. After we had finished, I climbed into bed with a sense of relief, knowing that whatever ghost had been bothering Caroline had been exterminated. That night, I was woken up yet again by Caroline, but this time she wasn't whispering my name. She was screaming it. There was terror in her voice, and I was so sure that I was having a nightmare. I was unusually warm, and I didn't know why. I went to shrug my blanket off, and it felt extremely hot to the touch. I opened my eyes in confusion and saw with horror that flames had filled my bedroom. Caroline was standing beside me, begging me to wake up. When I realized I wasn't dreaming, I leapt to my feet, grabbed Caroline's hand, and raced to my parents' bedroom. Once I had woken them up, we all sprinted outside, grabbing our dog just in time. Our neighbors had already noticed the fire and had called the fire department. They had been ringing our doorbell trying to wake us up to warn us. The fire department arrived quickly and did what they could, but the fire had already gotten completely out of control. We could do nothing but stand there and cry as we watched our beloved home burn to the ground. "Oh, Mommy, I know what happened," Caroline said. We all looked at her in shock. "It was the little girl. You burned down her house, so she burned down ours." A completely serious look on her face. We were shocked. We hadn't told Caroline about burning the Victorian-style dollhouse, just that we were getting rid of it. Weeks later, an investigation into the fire was conducted to find the source. The fire department explained that they had searched in great detail but could find no source of the cause. They were completely stumped. My family ended up leaving the area completely and moving to a brand new house. I never bought anything from a garage sale again. Be careful out there and sleep tight.